Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomoreshee.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, part 4 of our Second Temple Period Literature series, what is the Pseudepigrapha? Welcome back to the No More She broadcast as we continue part 4 in our Second Temple Period Literature series on what is the Pseudepigrapha. As we outlined in our previous video in part 3, when we introduced Second Temple Period Literature, we noted that there are 5 basic corpuses or bodies of text that comprise Second Temple Period Literature for the most part. And we're continuing our series with the second one, the Pseudepigrapha. Now, the next set are known as the Pseudepigrapha. Okay, the Pseudepigrapha books. And again, I'm afraid that this term has largely, again, been misused. And I really like, David De Silva. I'm sorry, but I'm just a fanboy of his, the way he writes. I just don't understand what it is when I read him, but the way he writes, it just resonates with me so well. So I went to his introduction to the New Testament on this. He actually is writing an introduction to this Pseudepigrapha, and I don't have a copy of that because it hasn't, been published yet. And he wanted to do it sooner as a companion to that volume, and someone else is now doing it. And he's doing it for another series. He wanted to, and it just didn't happen, and now he's doing it for another series, and someone else is taking on the work to do it. So, without having his book or the other author's book on this, since this texts are becoming more popular, because, again, no one necessarily, unless you go to our series on the canon, no one necessarily is going to say that these are God's word. Some people are. But what are they? Well, pseudepigraphy refers to the practice of writing in the name of another person or ascribing one's own work to another. In a sense, like a ghostwriter today, is kind of like that. This was a common practice in Jewish and Greco-Roman antiquity. So it's something they did all the time. And it was not a problem for them to do this. And so some people find this very difficult. And then because of this, it gives us problems in the 21st century, of which in the first century, there was no problem doing this. Matter of fact, a lot of times it honored a person that had died, and it was like collecting their teachings and getting it out. So it was very nice. And, it was just a literary technique they used. And whether or not we choose to agree with its use today, we need to understand it was accepted practice back then. And it was well worthy of doing. And it was accepted so much that we have copies of these because people kept them. They didn't destroy them. There are certain, when you go to the church fathers and the patristics, writers who write after this period, they're writing mainly from the 2nd century onwards. And when you go into the patristics literature, when you get into that, you're going to find that there are many works that we do not have copies of, that the only way that we can reconstruct them is when the patristic writers quote them, because they were arguing against them as bad or heretical thinking. And so we don't have those copies. They didn't survive because people didn't want them to survive. But these copies survived. And again, in order to produce documents in the ancient world, it was a very costly endeavor. And for them to survive history and all that goes on with the destruction of nature cycles and the degradation of text and understanding what happens, and even the burning of libraries from all the wars, like the library at Alexandria and things, for something to survive, that is remarkable. So anyway, it's a common practice. It's acceptable. As a rule, apocalypses and testaments do not bear the name of their actual author, but the name of noteworthy figure from Israel's sacred history to whom the work is attributed. So that was a common practice to do that, acceptable. If you didn't do this, they would be scratching their heads. Okay, this is, to not do this would be unacceptable in the ancient world in some sense. There would be questions by the people back then. So it's a common practice. So we just have to get used to that, even though it's not something that we necessarily have much faith in today. Thus, we have the Apocalypse of Abraham. Obviously, Abraham didn't write it because it's written in the first person from the perspective of Abraham. And that's a literary style, a technique. Okay, but he didn't write it. It's Second Temple period literature, right? So it's not written when Abraham is believed to have been around, okay? We have the Testaments of the 12 patriarchs, each written as if taken down a dictation from Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and the rest. So these were literary practices. Like, if I were to do an interview and sit down and talk to Abraham, what would he say? And it's taking the thinking of the Second Temple period literature and forming it into a body of literature and calling it the Testament of Abraham. That's it. It was just a practice they did back then, and they're valuable to us. There are dozens of other works where the text gives explicit impression of having been written by someone other than its real author. First Enoch, Second Baruch, Fourth Ezra, just to name a few. The practice is also well known to the Greeks and Romans, so it's just something they did in this time period. It's a standardized practice that we should embrace and expect them to use in order to preserve this knowledge for us. It's how they would have done it. We would have problems today as scholars looking back. If they didn't do this, we would have problems with it, actually, more so than people that are outside and untrained have problems with it because they don't understand. So it's the same problem. Early Christians, certainly throughout the 2nd through 4th centuries and beyond, produced a host of pseudepigraphical literature written in the name of a known apostle, like the Apocalypse of Paul, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, and the Correspondence of Paul and Seneca, and the like. So, it's something that even Christians indulge themselves in. We have to be careful. Again, are these a part of the canon? Well, go to our canon series. We're not arguing that here because some Christian traditions embrace some of these. But that doesn't mean they're not valuable to us. So each of these, De Silva goes on to say, each of these texts has something of great value to offer in terms of development of what is commonly called the Old Testament. I prefer the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew Scriptures. The Old Testament traditions in the intertestamental period. Again, what we're talking about, the Second Temple period. Developments picked up by the New Testament authors. They actually quote from this body of literature. They have no problem quoting from it. Reflections on ethics prior to the time of Jesus, tensions within Israel, and between Israel and foreign powers, the way the Hellenistic Jews made sense of their peculiar laws in terms of Greek philosophical and ethical values, and so forth. So they are valuable. So that's the second body of literature, okay, that's involved, is the pseudepigrapha. Again, we have translations of these available to us. R.H. Charles has done some. James Charlesworth has done some. And there are other now more prominent ways that you can get into these texts. Dr. Michael S. Heiser, whom we feature often on this broadcast, has done extensive work in things like Enoch. And even for Logos, he has done work in the Greek so that you can access the original languages behind these works. And we're specifically targeting those that are part of the Second Temple period literature and not the pseudepigraphal writings that follow in the later centuries by Christians. We're continuing to hold our line of Second Temple period, that time period that we discuss in part 2 in our timeline series. And the reason for holding this line should be obvious, but in case it's not, this is the actual time period or texts that correlate directly to the writings of the New Testament. Anything after this period no longer is influencing directly the New Testament writers. as anything written afterwards is more so affected by the New Testament writers rather than affecting directly the New Testament writers.
Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes and videos to help you with your journey from nomoresea.com.